while I'm already talking, it's good for me to give a small overview of the ecosystem call. Today,
Yeah,
of course,
sure.
it's in a different format. But before we dive into the DAO2DAO stuff, I just want to give a quick overview on what people would have got. So I guess first things first, I hope everyone had a good start of the year. Still feels
Thank
like
you.
it's just started, but we're already almost at the end of January. One of the biggest updates, or one of the updates from our side, was that we extended the first builder cycle to the 18th of January instead of what was before, I think the 11th or even the 9th, just because most people had a little bit more, or had need for a little bit more holiday after such a tense year, and I think we all deserved it. And I think overall it's fine. We're now right on track to start with the second cycle. Some proposals have already been submitted and passed. Others are still finalizing now. If you're at the point where you're still hesitant or we are working on a proposal, please let us know if you need any guidance. We're always here. Other update is that we launched a Prime rating beta, the public beta. Some people have been asking, why does it look different than the beautiful design you guys shared before? Reason being, the beautiful design takes a lot more effort still to finalize. We're doing user testing now. But what we needed first was a group of people that actually care sufficiently enough about Prime rating. So they're running rates now. We went from 5 raters to, I guess, now 10 people, and it's slowly growing and growing and growing. So we're doing that. Then we also finalized or got the grant from Balancer to work on the Balancer IDO interface. That's a big win from my perspective. It's also a cool way how PrimeDAO was able to facilitate this. And I guess if it was independent people, we would not have been able to accept this grant as easily because it takes you to lock Balancer tokens and what so. It's really hard on accounting and paying people. But because we have this DAO-to-DAO interaction with PrimeDAO is able to take on these Balancer tokens for a longer time frame, pay out the people that need to get paid now in USDC. We submitted a proposal for that as well, so everyone is okay with that. But it does allow PrimeDAO to build a really interesting product, potentially co-own that with Balancer, but also allow the people to work on it without feeling stressed. Today is maybe because we're doing DAO2DAO. If you have any specific questions about this, I guess just ping. There's a Discord channel about the IDO interface. Just jump in there and we'll hop on a call with you at any time when you want to answer questions or maybe help on. Next up, we had a Prime swag drop with Meta Factory at the end of the year. I haven't seen anyone wear Prime swag yet. So if you have, I think it's 70 DAI somewhere, go order that. It's fun, it's nice, it's cozy. And I think it's also somewhat of the start of on the one hand, Felipe's artsy talents that will start to unleash on PrimeDAO more and more, but also us exploring what NFTs can do and can mean for initiatives like PrimeDAO. And then one final bad thing is that our Substack, our newsletter, is not working. The communication group has a newsletter prepared for almost two weeks already. It's time to send out a third one, but we're unable to send it. We get an invalid error. We tried reaching out to Substack, but it's almost impossible to get a hand of them. So kind of wanted to check in if it's okay for us to, at least for now, move these newsletters to Medium, just circulating it through that way. But it is kind of bad because we had, I believe, 2,000 or 3,000 people subscribe to our newsletter from the pre-IDO campaigns or marketing and whatsoever. But yeah, for some reason it's not working yet, but hopefully that will be fixed soon. And yeah, that was kind of the ecosystem updates from my side. Maybe if someone still has something quick to pitch in, and if not, then we could start with the DAO2DAO stuff. Once, twice. I guess you can take the stage, Jeff.
Sounds great. I'm really interested in the Balancer IDO interface you guys are working on. By the way, there's a channel for that in the PrimeDAO
Discord. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. We'll definitely keep my eyes on that. That's pretty exciting. Yeah, awesome. So let me share screen here, and I'll pull up the research digest that we put together. Everybody can see conceptual models for DAO2DAO relations. Perfect. Okay, Cool. So this was, I think, a unique work cycle for us, because it was actually, there were two different proposals, one from BlockScience, one from Curve Labs. The stated interest of both was exploring this DAO2DAO interaction space, and how these tools can be developed for PrimeDAO to interact with other DAOs in the ecosystem. A lot of the research into DAOs and the work on DAO interfaces has so far focused on inter-DAO interactions, so how people interact within a DAO. And that this research was basically focusing on what kind of tools, what kind of mechanisms, primitives can improve the interlinkages between DAOs and kind of streamline and smooth out those work processes between different DAOs. I notice, so feel free throughout this presentation to drop questions into the chat. Feel free there, and we can answer questions. Ultimately, the purpose of this session is to be accountable to the PrimeDAO community, to present the research that was carried out in the first work cycle, what we're planning for future work cycles, and also to take feedback, comments, questions from the PrimeDAO community, and make sure that we are building you know, in a direction that is aligned with the ultimate goals of PrimeDAO, because that's our aim.
Question:
So,
are we going through
yeah.
just going through this doc, or do we want to talk about, I mean, like something slightly more general before we get into it? Because I feel like this is maybe putting the cart before the horse, because I want to, like, if it's okay with you, I'd rather like start by talking about the sort of approach to research and the approach to, you know, sort of DAO2DAOs at large, because I think it's actually really important. And maybe the first comment on that is just, we are definitely in a like sort of a new, let's call it socio-technical space, where we're exploring something that is simultaneously very old, in the sense that we're talking about the relationships between individuals and organizations with each other, in a way that maybe doesn't just reduce back to hierarchies and sort of, you know, subservient power relations, right? Like we have a lot of that. Both between organizations where one dominates another, and with individuals and organizations where they're sort of strict, you know, directed graph hierarchies. And I think that it's important to understand that the technologies that we build, they imply and they contain models of how the world works. And when you build technology with a particular ontology or a model of the world in your head, then you reproduce that model of the world. And a lot of the time in crypto, we inherit old models, even the models that our narratives like disparage, because we just know them and we don't even realize that we're reintroducing them. And so an important sort of groundwork for the kind of DAO2DAO technologies that are being built by PrimeDAO is to make explicit and acknowledge the models of, you know, inter-organizational relationships, the models of interpersonal relationships, and the models of people's relationships with organizations. And so I know that this particular work is probably a bit theoretical from the perspective of this group, but I really wanted to start by saying that in good scientific research, you need to lay groundwork. Otherwise, you are going to sort of either recreate something unintentionally, you're going to miss opportunities, you're not going to be able to accomplish the kinds of design interventions that PrimeDAO hopes to accomplish. So just as a starting point, before we get into it, understand that we started with conceptual models for a reason, because you need to make them explicit when you're building technology in order to take them into account. So if you want to like follow up on that line of thinking, I have a short article called that I wrote with a PhD student in ethnography from our MIT's blockchain group about you know, the role of reflexivity in tech, and also some other work on algorithms as policies that we cite here. But the reason I bring this up is because I want to make sure that we understand that good technological research, especially related to design and implementation of new patterns for social relations, requires baselining. Otherwise, you really are missing the opportunity to change the way things work. Anyway, so we can continue and go through it, but that's sort of like a meta motivation for why you're going to see conceptual models as the first you know, task in this research program.
Fantastic, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the context there, Z. So basically the focus of the BlockScience research team, at least in the first work cycle, was to really define the landscape and to explore a lot of relevant concepts. So the research report is broken down into 3 sections. So we covered the DAO concept and history, where it came from, how to define it specifically, because a lot of the time in these kind of nascent research areas, definitions vary widely, and depending on the definition you choose, you have all sorts of different potentials coming out of that. So defining the terminology, understanding conceptual models, different ways we can look at DAOs and their interactions, and also framing DAOs in the context of international relations. So there's a massive literature of foreign relations, international relations, multilateral agreements. So a lot of our research was exploring some of these concepts and just surfacing them so that there can be, the appropriate reading and research on behalf of the PrimeDAO community, so that we move into implementations and deployments with a fuller picture of where this fits in with established literature and research. So we won't spend a ton of time going through this piece by piece, but we can introduce a couple of the concepts. I'm sure everyone here is quite familiar with what a DAO is and the history of where they came from. Some of the conceptual models that we spoke about, we're breaking down kind of the multi-scale interoperability of DAOs. So we have, agent-to-agent interactions within a DAO. We have agent-to-institution interactions. We have institution-to-agent interactions, and we have institution-to-institution interactions, which is kind of the DAO2DAO level. So understanding these different dynamics, there are plenty of different ways that we can look at interactions within and between DAOs, and of course, this requires different scale perspectives. This is, in terms of modeling and simulation, CAD/CAD is a multi-scale simulation tool. So this is kind of understanding the different perspectives of multi-scale systems and how they can be simulated and understood in the context of complex systems. We also put a bit of work into, sorry, was there a question there? Oh.
I think we have somebody who just needs to mute, probably.
Okay, cool. And also, if there are any questions that pop up as we go through this, feel free to stop us and ask for clarification or raise a point if you disagree or need any further.
Yeah, maybe.
Comments.
I feel like we're flying through in a way that maybe is hard to consume. Is it easier
Sure.
if you're cool with it? Do you want to go back up to the first part, and maybe we can just have me or Sherman or somebody make some like comments that are like, summaries or salient points from the sections, as opposed to just like, hey, here's an article? Because I feel like there's more we could add to feed the discussion rather than just kind of here it is. So if you don't mind, maybe go back to the top, Go to the header, and let's see. If we start with this first part of concepts and history, I think the salient point is that the concepts of autonomy and decentralization in the context of organizations predates not just Web3. It predates most of computing. So it's not necessarily a concept that's related to implementation via technology. This is already a important topic in the notion of organization. So autonomy is about the ability to make informed, uncoerced decisions, and in the same way that an individual might think about their self-actualization, an autonomous organization is one that effectively self-actualizes. The organization decides for itself what it gets to do and what it values, etc. So it's actually something that we want to tease out and away from the concept of automation or like automatons, like computer systems or robots. Now, that's not to say the words are unrelated. The use of the term automation still has to do with making a machine able to make its own decisions. But the trap here is that a machine can actually only make its own decisions if you have given it an explicit sort of governing rule, a goal of some kind, and it can learn and optimize in a lot of ways, but it's always beholden back to the goals you set for it. So it's never really autonomous in the sense that it can make its own decisions, and it's this sort of, informed, uncoerced way, because you are in a sense, coercing it, or in a sense, giving it, you give it the objective you want it to achieve, or, you know, people give machines through some algorithms or software. So honestly, I think this is a point of importance, especially when it comes to DAO-to-DAO relations, because you have to look at the relative autonomy of organizations that are interacting with each other. So they can, you know, you could be autonomous in the sense that you make your own decisions, but if your organization makes commitments to another organization or to individuals, then in some level, the freedom is like co-restrictive. So actually examining the term autonomy in its more political, economic, or political philosophical perspective is actually really important for understanding DAO-to-DAO. I don't know if that is something that we want. Like, there's several points in this article that we could stop and have discussions about, but this was one that I think we wanted to escalate to the group. And decentralization is actually quite similar. It's not a technical property, and from a political philosophy perspective, it has to do with really that autonomy or that decision-making capacity being distributed, not necessarily physically distributed things, but actually that sort of the autonomy itself is being spread out. And so when we have this sort of DAO-to-DAO model, we're actually already talking about the DAOs themselves being decentralized, in a sense that there's sort of a self-actualization for all of the individual agent participants. And then the DAO, which is the organization or the group, then itself has some autonomy as a group, but then there's a fractal of decentralization because you move up to the next level and you have this network of DAOs working together or making decisions or interacting in a way that is itself somewhat autonomous from maybe a more traditional institutional organizational paradigm. So there's some really interesting things coming out of how and why what we've been actually doing is the same and different to existing concepts. And then, you know, the article goes through some, you know, recent history from the term DAO. It comes up through, you know, Vitalik and other writing. And, you know, an observation that we make here is that, you know, Vitalik's description is essentially a vision of the world where you have a cyber-physical system that is exhibiting this sort of collective intelligence rather than some sort of, you know, Skynet style intelligence. And that comes from the interaction effects between the individual humans into organizations and the organizations into, you know, higher order compositions. But it ultimately, what we would hope for is that this thing would be collectively more intelligent than our current institutional paradigm. And I kind of put it in contrast to the other applications of large-scale distributed data decision-making systems, which basically look like surveillance capitalism and, you know, there's allusion here to Soviet central planning, but also things like Project CyberSyn, and there's like a cybernetic central planning literature from, you know, decades ago that really kind of bashed up against reality. But we see a lot of resurgence of the underlying ideologies behind that. And there's a lot of problematic stuff there. So, you know, maybe one point is that this work is actually really important as a counter flow to this massive techno-centralization of decision-making, where we're talking about a sort of techno-decentralization. And I mean this in the political philosophy sense, the spreading the authority to make decisions, the uncoerced decisions out to the last mile, but also allowing intermediate aggregations of people, because to the point earlier about balancer and the collection of tokens and risk mitigation, you do need organizations at multiple levels to give people freedom. Otherwise, they're going to be stuck turning cranks and doing all the procedurals. So these mid-scale organizations have a lot of value in that architecture. Anyway, so I'm going to pause for a moment because I think we should chat. This is like me trying to describe the sort of research from how we better understand what we're doing so we can do it better way. And I'm hoping that's helpful for people.
Yeah. And I think the background is also like, at least our experience, my personal experience also having been in the Web3 field for a long time, was that in the early days of the DAO, at least, there was, or even Bitcoin, there was this a romantic idea that a code can replace human conflict, and it can't. And I think we have somewhere in the paper is like politics will stay politics within a DAO and in between DAOs, right? People are people and they're not on the same page. They have different needs, opinions, philosophies of life, but within a system, whether it's within a DAO or then in between DAOs, there will always be friction. And that kind of friction, that governance process of deciding which direction to go, will always be the human part of steering the automated part, right? And that's very, very important. So this is why we refer to prior work where we also outlined all this and try to make it clear with the different laws of robotics, etc. It's like we're creating the system, and how do we want to create the system, and how do these systems then want to interact with each other? So this is why this the basis was very important.
Do you want to continue, Jeff? So the next section is interscale models. So for people who aren't familiar, Sherman and I wrote an academic paper on the foundations of crypto economic systems some time ago. And some of these drawings, the system level behavior, policy goal setting, and agent level behavior diagrams are part of that work that we built upon. And here we're basically talking about these, separation between or keeping track of the notion of the relationship between individuals and entities and each other. And I think one of the reasons that this is important is because one of the experiences we've had in real DAOs, many of us are involved in several, is that there's a sort of tendency to have a lot of bureaucratic labor inside of DAOs when they're making decisions as a group, which isn't inherently bad, but there's always trade-offs for individuals. They sort of, if they're making decisions in the sort of Hirschman sense to sort of exit or to participate or voice, the process through which they would voice their opinions, whether those are forums or votes, etc., and the amount of sort of time and energy that they have to spend in order to sort of advance their agenda within the organization is going to affect their desire to say. In a sense, their own ability to self-actualize within the DAO is put in contrast to the ability of the DAO to self-actualize in a larger system, or even to steer or induce specific behaviors on the part of the participants. So you kind of have to look at the DAO as, on one hand, a wrapper for a bunch of individuals, and on the other hand, an individual in a broader system. And you have to kind of balance in both directions. And this is tricky because from a procedure standpoint, there's a direct tension here. You have the more freedom you give the individuals, the less sort of steering capacity you have. But on the other hand, if you can sort of put a lot of control on what the participants can do, you might sort of undermine what brought them there in the first place, which was a kind of effort to participate in a system where they have more control of their own destiny. So there's always going to be Pareto points. And in fact, part of this work argues that there isn't one optimal solution, but rather there's a constellation of different characteristics of DAOs which are viable, and that the participants in those DAOs may vary widely depending on their preferences. And you kind of have a diversity both within a DAO of skills and personalities, and then but you might have some consistent norms or consistent preferences that brought people sort of coalesce in the same group. And then you might have many different kinds of DAOs. And this is sort of a voting with your feet kind of model, where you're like, okay, well, if this isn't right for me, maybe I can find another one. And what's really interesting about the DAO2DAO model is that I might actually have a lot of shared belief in what, say, DAO1 is building, but the politics of DAO1 doesn't quite work for me, like the way they manage work, pay for work, do whatever. I might work in another DAO that has some sort of relationship with that DAO, and maybe I get compensated by the other DAO for my contributions to that DAO's contributions to the first one's work. And in fact, I've still managed to work on the thing that I wanted to work on, but with a relationship to a DAO and to others within the DAO that works better for me than maybe the relationship that was provided to me by the one that was directly doing the work that I was interested in. So there's a lot of really interesting phenomena emerging in this like sort of social ontology. So if you scroll down, Jeff, can you go to where we made the grids? we started working on some like what I'll call a metric space. And if anyone has read Token Space by Wasim El-Sindi, he did this with some like regulatory considerations for tokens. And in fact, he basically called the whole Ripple as a security thing years in advance because it was an outlier in his constructed metric space, token space. And what we're doing here is a very similar procedure of creating quantitative measures for qualitative concepts. And you do this using idealized extremes. You define a term. Now, obviously, it takes some time to iterate on these definitions because there tend to be normative or subjective concepts. But ultimately, you append these endpoints on the concept, and then you localize things in that range. So here we were exploring the concepts of transaction costs, information availability, sovereignty, trust level, and rigidity. And we have the working definitions in the doc. I'm going to caveat this by saying these are working definitions because we need to apply them to things to sort of refine the measures. But in this first diagram, we use some idealized institutions to try to get a sense of whether these were expressive, meaning there's a lot of variation in these idealized institutions. But more pointedly, if you go down, Jeff. We started looking at some examples to sort of feel out whether it worked. And so, we were kind of placing Bitcoin in PrimeDAO and Google, and like, we're sort of saying like, look, here's a corporation, here's a DAO, here's a different, Bitcoin is interpreted here as a DAO or as an institution, really, and say OneHive, and look at how they express differently in this space and sort of say, okay, so this is a potentially very expressive space. Now, if you scroll down a little bit more, I want to make a point about Wittgenstein's ruler. This is like super, I guess it's further up. I introduced this concept of Wittgenstein's ruler because we're designing metrics. And that means that the metrics aren't useful to measure things. Things are useful for measuring the ruler. It's like, this is like a philosophical concept around measuring things. And Wittgenstein's ruler is like the idea that if you have a ruler and you measure something in the real world, the thing in the real world is actually measuring the ruler. Or I like to describe this in terms of like, suppose you have a yardstick and a table. Until someone shows you that the table is the length of a yard and you build an intuition for how much a yard is, having a yardstick doesn't help you very much. Measuring how many yards something is useless if the notion of a yard isn't anchored in reality. So when we start doing this sort of rather complex mapping exercise of building attributes and defining those attributes and embedding them on spectra in order to get a better perception of these sort of constellations of organizations, we have to apply this concept and say, okay, well, we need to do a pass or two. We need to create the metrics, test them out on stuff, then see what the stuff tells us about the metrics, refine the metrics, and then we can go forward and use those metrics confidently. And in particular, the reason why these metrics seemed valuable to us is because they characterize some of the things that would lead someone to join or leave a particular DAO, or whether two particular DAOs have enough in common to sort of benefit from some sort of relationship between them. An example here would be some DAOs might have really strong central powers in the sense that the DAO makes decisions maybe through voting process, et cetera, but others might not. So if you look at something like Bitcoin, where effectively the rules can change if a majority of the hash power controlling miners change the code and agree to stick to it, that gives you a sort of different kind of institutional steering mechanism. And so is it even possible for an organization like that to enter into an agreement with another one? And the answer is possibly no. And so understanding these constellations of, DAO institutional things is actually important for understanding what kinds of DAO-to-DAO patterns can and should exist or need to exist. And maybe there are cases where some of the organizations need extra interaction patterns, code or tech to create binds that work for organizations that are more different from each other. Or maybe there are patterns between organizations that have certain similarities on certain dimensions that make them particularly suitable for having relationships with each other. So that kind of research to inform design and development of DAO-to-DAO tech sort of sets the basis for why are we building DAO2DAO tech and what kind of thing we can build, more so than how do we actually get it built. Now we would collaborate and are collaborating with the other teams within the PrimeDAO to sort of pair this up with the sort of implementation feasibility concepts. Like, okay, if we have ideas of, these whys and whats, then how do we go from, whats to hows, which is more about the actual technological design and implementation and testing, which then feeds back on the more organization research by saying like, well, how did people actually use this? And that's sort of nice where many of us are involved in multiple DAOs. I'm a member of One Hive and Metagame and Common Stack and kind of actively participating and token engineering. And I've been like kind of helping push along these different dimensions. And I really have seen a difference in the flavor of these organizations that's pretty considerable, but there's also really interesting collaborations going on between the various groups and sort of distilling the essence of what works so that we can make that easier. If we recognize in the social layer what people are doing, even when it's a little bit hard, those are exactly the things that we want to make easier. And so that's going to kind of feed back into, sort of actual designs and implementations of tools for DAO2DAO relationships, which is kind of where Gem and the Curve Labs team picks up. I'm going to pause here, though, because Sherman also did quite a bit of great research for building the analogy to international relations, since this has got some important similarities in terms of differences at the state level, still allowing for a wide range of interactions.
Yeah, so am I muted? No, I'm on. Okay, so when we look at DAOs, and this is what we mentioned at the beginning, DAOs have more similarities, especially the more autonomy the individual actors in the networks have with nation states than with companies. And so if you look into the field of international relation, politics, social sciences, the field actually of international relation is exactly what deals with these huge kind of socioeconomic institutions that are organized in nation state kind of concepts with their legal frameworks. And they have relations to each other, which is why we thought that this is a natural starting point of our research, because in a growing DAO ecosystem, there will be DAO-to-DAO interaction that will be more and more formalized. So where can we learn from? And obviously from the field of international relations. But obviously DAOs are in international relations. We have two types of entities. We have the nation state, which is kind of the field of international relations was kind of defined with the rise of the nation state in maybe a few hundred years ago, right? But then as we had more and more international trade, and especially in the last 30 years with the emergence of the internet, we have new types of institutions. Before the internet, we had the multinational corporations that became bigger and more powerful over time, and were independent kind of non-nation state actors, right? Non-state actors is what they're referred to. And now with the internet platforms that have emerged, especially since the Web 2, we have a completely new type of non-state actor. And when we look at Cambridge Analytica, censoring of Donald Trump, for example, this is a reflection of this new type of non-state actor that has a lot of influence, but we haven't found kind of the formalisms yet to how these non-state actors interact with state actors and vice versa. And in the Web3, we have a completely new type of internet platform, which is much more decentralized than the Facebooks and Twitters, etc. So we have a new type of DAOs are a new type of non-state actor, but DAOs in themselves are not consistent either. So what we're trying to do in our research, and we try to only lay out the major questions, is like, what is the field of international relations? And there is no unified lens on international relations. So in the first part, kind of in this third chapter, we try to give you an overview of kind of what international relation is. It was born out of the nation-state concept, but is transcending the nation-state concept more and more. And but there is no unified view on that. There are different schools of thought that are more realistic, more deterministic, more descriptive, more how it should be. And it becomes this fuzzy socioeconomic lens on a mix of philosophy and applied social science. and now we throw in the tech in the mix, right? So what we did in the second part is identify the possible research questions that will be relevant in the future. And for these research questions, we need to understand the different terminologies. Nation state, for example, sorry, I have to, the concept of nation states, the concept of non-state actor, and how that reflects on DAOs. Or the concept of foreign policy. What does foreign policy mean translated to a DAO, right? Obviously, we probably use a different term, but a DAO like Ethereum is a sort of DAO and has some kind of formalized or mostly informalized relations to the Bitcoin community, right? And what is foreign policy between the Ethereum community and the Bitcoin community? And will we one day, might we have a classical instrument of foreign policy in the nation state concept are diplomats, right? The kind of diplomats are the representatives that have a mandate to negotiate with other state and non-state actors. Will we have something like that in DAOs in the future? Right now, we don't have that so much. We might have a community manager or a social media manager or kind of marketing manager or at a higher level of the DAO. If we have more centralized DAOs, we have some kind of, community marketing, whatever manager to communicate with the outside world. But I'm sure that a wide array of mechanisms and institutions that are more or less centralized will evolve to reflect these interaction patterns between DAOs. Power and power blocks and measuring power concentration is a very, very, very important aspect, I think, also in the concept of DAOs. And this is actually what we would like to focus on in our next part of our research. So what is power? In classical economics and in classical social science, power is defined in a very conservative way, like how much military force you have, what your GDP is, etc. But there are many ways, many different forms of what we call hard power and soft power. And in Web3 networks, you have the cultural influences, you have the economic flows, you have the decentralization of the community or the centralization or the power blocks within the community. For example, mining blocks would be very obvious example for a power block, but we also have power around opinion leaders, for example, in networks such as Ethereum, where the founder is very visible and people follow what he says. Ethereum Vitalik would be such an example. Satoshi Nakamoto, as long as he was present online, was also such a community leader with very high levels of soft power in the network, right? So power concentration, power distribution, the interaction of power, it will be a very interesting line of research, which we can quantify, and it might become even more tangible in this next phase. And another question is sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean?
Power.
Yeah.
Since we talked about this as a next step, Sherman, I wanted to kind of comment on the diagraphs. So keep in mind that this concentration measure that's provided is sort of just from a historical point of reference, and it's kind of naive from an empiricism or from a even from a sort of formalism standpoint. So now that we kind of live in the age of networks, the most natural representation of power relations is actually that of a digraph or a directed graph, which basically means that any individual or entity can be interpreted as a node and that a power relation is an edge. And what's interesting about this is that although much like the other metrics we started to discuss, it's not obvious that we can, create a, measurement of that directly, besides creating a sort of interpretation. But if you start to fill that graph in, you realize a couple things are different in the age of networks, so to speak, these crypto networks. One is that a lot more power relations have loops, meaning instead of directed graphs, we have a lot of sort of bilateral, albeit not necessarily the same weight. You have short cycles, meaning I have sort of power or influence over you and you over me. And actually part of the agreement and the relationship that we have is bilateral by virtue of the high presence of the exit option. So the more exit option people have, the more natural it is for a relationship between any two individuals or an individual and organization or an organization and another organization, the more bilateral it is. Because out of necessity, if it becomes too lopsided or not essentially mutually beneficial in some way, then the party on the downside is just going to opt out. And so if we start to realize that we have a lot more parity in power relations, it doesn't mean they're not unbalanced though. And so when you start to construct the sort of graph theoretic model, if you have this directed weighted graph, even if it's a conceptual object, there are much more advanced measures of things like concentration, like basically how balanced the graph is, or there's sort of algebraic measures that will tell you something about mixing processes on that graph. And, at risk of going into the computational social science and network science, just understanding that the study of social networks already starts to provide some empirical, quantitative, or at least like, quantitative social science techniques or computational social science techniques for evaluating graph structures. And I think, from my perspective, within the context of power relations, these graph structures are very different from the ones we've observed in previous organizations, not just because of the technology, but because the technology enables patterns with a higher degree of opting out, which leads to more parity, which leads to a very different sort of topology of the power graph. And I think in a lot of ways, it's more balanced in the sense that people organize themselves into places that fit them better. I'm not sure that this is perfectly the case. I think we definitely still have situations where, people exercise power and other people are beholden to that power. But it's nice to see that some of these tools that we're building and even institutional patterns we are realizing may actually have, they may allow us to create and demonstrate good measures of why they're better using sort of graph theoretic constructions that say, look, like a org chart is a DAG and it sucks. On the other hand, here's a social network like graph where people have some sort of mutual opt-in, which results in a different topology, maybe still a scale-free network. Certainly there's preferential attachment dynamics, but ultimately those graph topologies have both different realizations in the quantitative sense and also very different lived experiences for the participants. So that's also sort of a consequence.
I just want to make sure we leave some time for the Curve Labs portion of the research. So this is basically a lot of the discussion towards the end of this was basically going into Workcycle 2, but I do want to leave some time. I know we only have 5 minutes left in this session, and I wanted to turn it over to Jem to present kind of the Curve Labs, where we take some of this theoretical research and turn it into applied and implementation potential for PrimeDAO. So I'll turn the screen share over to Jem, if I can find how to stop sharing, that's great. And yeah, I'd like to open up the floor for Jem from Curve Labs to talk about how we're taking this theoretical research and applying it for PrimeDAO uses.
There we go. Thank you so much, Jeff, Z, Sharmin. Yeah, just to maybe also just talk a little bit about our structure of research, the way we sort of try to harness the different spirits of BlockScience and Curve Labs, like the doer and the sort of the researcher mindsets came, I think, in my opinion, quite complementarily together in this research group. So what we try to do is to start from asking questions about implementability of these protocols. Obviously, you cannot do that while being completely isolated from a theoretical grounding, because as the previous research explained quite well, first you have to reconcile with what type of agents you're interacting with in your system, right? So like we're talking about DAOs interacting with each other. So how do you classify a DAO? How do you classify different types of expressions in DAOs? How do you design for monolithic expression versus granular expression and so on? So like as you dive into the problem itself, you see that how it branches out infinitely, that it's almost essential to have a theoretical understanding of the possibility space that you're interacting with. This is why it has been very, very helpful to every week come together with BlockScience team and share together what we think is the necessary components, necessary theoretical primitives, but also necessary technical primitives that could bring this to life. So just, I'm going to do the same. I don't want to read you the article, or I don't want to explain you the article in itself. I will just go over it as to explain our approach. So I think we have two main components in this research. The first one is to achieve this theoretical grounding in order to implement negotiation protocols on a decentralized autonomous organization format. So as Curve Labs, we had this sort of very operational question guiding us. And as a side element of that, theoretical grounding for negotiation protocols, as a side element of that, it was another task of ours was to find the suitable primitives in the wild, in the crypto ecosystem that fits this description of a decentralized negotiation protocol, so that we can actually propose a minimum lovable implementation, a minimum viable product. So we did go into that. You can find this in the article. I think we also have little time, but we talk about the importance of, as Z mentioned, social choice in networks, and also having an understanding of sort of characteristics of DAOs, having an understanding of social influence in game theory and so on. So like we just gathered this sort of collection of literature primitives that we think can be very useful in the next phases of the research and implementation. And then we go on to do the same thing for the technical side. I don't know, Max, if you feel like just doing a quick rundown here.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of when we were going into our technical research, as kind of in the design objectives, we obviously wanted to produce something that was as kind of as modular as possible. So something that was as compostable as possible, which is a fairly kind of standard objective like within software development. So I'm not really going to go into that too much. And we were also looking as well at creating something that was as agnostic as possible. So because of the kind of the breadth of different, as has been discussed already, there's a breadth of different kinds of DAOs, different technical implementations, different things they're built upon. And so we were essentially trying to create something that never really relied or specified a particular type of DAO that it could or would have to interact with. And similarly with the actual kind of the agreement that comes out of this negotiation protocol as well, we also wanted to remain as agnostic as possible with regards to how that actually comes about between the two DAOs. So we were really trying to, with these design objectives, we were really trying to strip down to the, I suppose, like the core mechanisms of, or like the crux points within a negotiation turning into an agreement, and how we could then kind of turn that into a mechanism that you could just implement in the Web3 space, basically.
Max, maybe we look at the chart that we have made, and then we can go through a little bit, show the community a little bit of the primitives.
Sure.
So just again, a quick overview here. Here we discuss certain use cases that can come out of such inter-organizational negotiation. And one of the first ones that we're targeting is this joint venture idea, that like two organizations can come together to fund a common good, or some sort of a quasi-public good, in the sense that this is a public good for these two communities to come together. It makes sense for them. And we will run with this use case towards implementation in order to have our first sort of empirical understandings and iteration cycles initiate already in this cycle. But other interesting use cases are also out there, such as token swaps and larger alliances of funding public goods, complete mergers and acquisitions, but also going to a different level, collective monetary policy and things like that. So the possibility space is quite large. What we're trying to do here is to understand where can we go with the primitives that we have today available in the crypto ecosystem. So in the sense that tech readiness is our filter, looking at this while we're selecting these primitives. So here you see also visually a couple of different interaction patterns. Here you see a DAO, the monolithic expression of consensus come into, in terms of votes into the DAO, and DAOs coming to agreement inside the negotiation protocol, triggering another event. And we are speculating here that we could actually facilitate another mode of DAO2DAO interactions by triggering some sort of a whitelisted marketplace for only these two DAOs constituents. And then this marketplace has certain parameterizations based on the proposals that two communities are extending towards each other. And this is very interesting in so many other ways, because here not only you have the agency of the institution or of the collective, but also individual utility functions allowing you to make, in certain cases, much finer price discovery within the bounds of the deals that have been extended. Yeah, and I'll actually leave this to Max to maybe, if you want to run down again.
Great. So kind of if you could actually scroll down, yeah, could you actually scroll down a bit and just have a look at the flow diagram that we laid out? So to kind of place, to kind of position these primitives like within the larger idea of what we were doing. So this flow diagram here is essentially mapping out the interaction, the two phases of interaction, the kind of inter-DAO negotiation and then the smart contract level negotiation between two DAOs that we're going to map out for, as Cem said, this first use case, kind of looking at this kind of escrow logic use case. So you have the monolithic consensus on two DAOs. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this first is because the way that we wanted to design everything is we wanted to look at the flow of how this would happen, and then look simultaneously at primitives that already exist that we could kind of slot in to the various crux points in a diagram like this. So I just kind of wanted to ground it like that. But if Cem, could you go up to the table again?
Absolutely.
I'll see. I'll kind of great. So basically, yeah, what we did here was we were looking at we split everything. These are broad, kind of slightly fuzzy boundaries, obviously, but primitives, assemblage of these kind of primitives, so existing implementations of the primitive type, I suppose is how you could look at it, and then use case. So for something like a collateral lock and a payout mechanism, then one of the assemblages that we looked at was the conditional tokens framework from Gnosis, which is usually, it's usually being used for kind of futarchy and prediction market stuff. So Omen is using it, for instance. But there's a very interesting possible use case there for a DAO2DAO interaction where you could have like collateral tokens being created between two DAOs, but then further conditions being made, say if the DAO has two teams internally who are going to be working on different parts of a potential joint venture. And also has maybe more use cases in the future implementations of this non-monolithic consensus that Chem also looked at, like just kind of we glanced over then. And
just a quick
kind of
question.
Sure.
How much overtime
Oh yeah.
like us to go actually? Because like yeah, as you see, this is like quite detailed.
Yeah.
If you go into every primitive.
I think we should just keep presenting it because we're recording anyway. So maybe if we do a little bit of editing because we had some.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess from now, anyone who was here just for a normal ecosystem meetup would have a hard stop. I know Rivet has one. Regardless, thanks everyone. I think we should just continue and finish this as we're recording as well. And I think those that listen in are enjoying it. It's almost like a podcast. I think it's wonderful. So just go on. If anyone has questions that you didn't get the chance to ask, or maybe it also takes some time to just let us all sink in. The DAO2DAO channel is always open in Discord, and I think this is just the start of this initiative. So thanks from my side. I'll be listening in. Also need to start hopping off slowly. Yeah, looking forward to this. Let's see how this progresses. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Absolutely, everyone. You know you can reach us. We're just a Discord away. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to get in touch. If you think you have an idea on the subject, feel free to get in touch. But yeah, Max, take it away.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'll slow down a bit now as well. So sorry, I lost my place. Yeah, escrow. So basically looking at the mechanism of a potential joint venture for DAOs, the obvious thing that comes to mind is an escrow contract, which is, for people who learn how to program smart contracts in Solidity, it's one of the first examples of a Solidity smart contract in the Solidity docs, right? So everyone kind of knows what an escrow is, but it's a particularly powerful tool potentially as well if we're looking at these DAO2DAO relations, and this is actually the first example that we mapped out in the flowchart as the first way of bringing around this joint venture that happens where all of the negotiation agreements actually happen, but kind of within the Web3 space, so excluding the need for kind of legal arrangements. And although there are lots of different kind of escrow implementations, one of the ones we looked at was Kleros, which they run their own decentralized escrow service. And there's not that much more to say with an escrow. It's quite a simple idea, but it's a very powerful tool. And obviously, when you have something like an escrow, or in the case of the conditional tokens framework, an oracle, so a third party of some kind, or an aggregated decision from kind of crowdsourcing, can be very useful when you need someone outside of both teams to make a decision whether X did actually happen, right? And so whether payout will or won't happen. And kind of at two ends of the Oracle spectrum, I suppose, you have, on the one hand, you have API 3 and their Air node, where they're proposing what they call like a first person Oracle. So a service that is actually run by the person who is also running the infrastructure for this Oracle as well. And they have a really good series on their Medium account. So if this is something that interests you, I kind of really recommend checking that out. And on the other end of this,
One interesting news that dropped, just want to share it also with the people who are here, is API 3 announced, I think yesterday, an integration to Omen on XDAI. So the prediction market of Gnosis on XDAI. And I think that's like basically,
okay.
because as far as I know, Omen is using conditional tokens framework. So meaning that on XDAI, you have this integration already take place. So this could really speed things up for our implementation as well.
Okay. Yeah, that is super interesting to know. Yeah, and I mean, like I said, Omen was using the conditional tokens framework. So as you can see, a lot of the assemblages of all of these primitives are also in use elsewhere as well, which is, heartening news if we're wanting to be designing with them too. Yes. But yeah, so on the other end of the spectrum, you have reality.eth, which is more of a kind of a crowdsourcing Oracle decision service, which brings around, one of the things that came up when we were looking at this stuff, especially with concerning oracles, is that what might arise further in the project's kind of development, or when you have the potential to have different forms of DAO2DAO interaction be kind of created via some kind of a factory or a series of factory contracts, is that the actual the decision making, or whether you need an oracle, then that breaks down into what types of oracles would be best for different arrangements of negotiations, depending on kind of like how concrete the thing that is meant to happen actually is, which is another massive area of potential research. And to kind of more quickly go through this, then another primitive that we had was dispute resolution, or some kind of dispute adjudication, which the example, because we already looked at Claris's escrow contract system, is that decentralized court system, which kind of explains itself. And also finally, Keeper network with the 3. So not necessarily for larger scale decisions, but if there was some kind of a DevOps-esque maintenance that has to be done to some of the smart contracts that have been created, then Keeper is, a really good platform for doing that, basically.
And maybe just to tie into the phase 2, which is the period that we are in already. As I mentioned, we will be building the escrow MVP. And I think we will use the simplest tools that are out there in order to go to an implementation very fast. And all in the meanwhile, we are seeing the variety of use cases really demand a similar variety in terms of the solution approaches proposed as a solution, meaning that different types of negotiation protocols. There is no one type of agreement that is the panacea for each type of alignment. So as we start to see that, our idea became much more clear that we have to design some sort of a negotiation protocol factory. So where the modularity in approach becomes really, really relevant. And so for the phase 2, our priority will be building this MVP while sort of designing a factory where you can tweak the parameters and tweak the primitives of the assemblage overall. And we expect this to integrate much closer in the upcoming phases with the research that's being done from the BlockScience side, because what we did was basically to start from opposite ends and go towards each other, basically, in the sense that like we start from the primitives and BlockScience starts from the theory, and then as we come closer, which we saw in our sort of weekly calls, where every passing week we could actually, there were new vectors that we could operationalize in implementation research. And this chart is, I think, extremely relevant to illuminate that point.
Where to
Any
unmute?
questions?
Okay, there we go.
As far as the Curve Lab
I
side
can
is
comment on the
concerned.
chart. I've made versions of this chart probably a dozen times because I've led research organizations in a variety of entities. And one of the things I've learned is that it's really easy to not see the slow moving aspect of work when you're tied up in the fast moving. So day-to-day is fast. Development is a little slower. Applied research is a little slower. And like the more foundational research is a little slower. And in an organization, which is essentially a decision-making system, you need to be able to operate in multiple timescales. If you're too day-to-day, you effectively thrash. But if you're too basic research, you know, without any day-to-day stuff, then you're like slow and you don't do anything. And so what you actually do to make a healthy organization is build the capacity for a spectrum of timescales. And so in fact, this is in some ways its own part of organizational research, because what we're arguing for is that a healthy DAO that's going to be an evolving adaptive entity is actually going to be able to function in all four of these layers. And so I personally find it pretty exciting to see the pattern emerging in a DAO, because I've seen it in sort of, you know, government and corporate and, you know, academic and non-academic and like a range of places like emerge naturally. And so we would expect it to be sort of also a necessary organizational primitive, even if it's not something you implement per se in code, it's something that you observe in a healthy organization, its ability to operate sort of simultaneously and collaboratively in multiple timescales. So I would even highlight this as in some way part of the DAO2DAO research.
Yeah, I think it would be great to drop this in the chat as well for the community to take a look.
I think so too.
For sure. And I think that kind of, this is a chart that kind of unifies the two research prongs of this D2D collaboration, where we have kind of the theoretical and applied on behalf of the BlockScience team, and applied and development on behalf of the Curve Labs team. And ultimately we're kind of parallel, you know, research and development at the same time, and blending that structure and emergence and being able to build more robust primitives all in all because of it. Yeah, I'll be happy to share this, drop this in the DAO2DAO channel. And that was one of the primary bits of feedback from the PrimeDAO community thus far, is how is the research being done in this collaboration applicable to, you know, the development needs of PrimeDAO. So ultimately what we're trying to do is sketch out the picture of how these slower research cycles turn into, you know, applied research development and primitives and tools for PrimeDAO and the DAO ecosystem at large. Awesome. Well, I think we can continue the discussion and Q&A in the DAO2DAO channel. If there's any further questions, we'll post this recording as well, and hopefully people have a chance to catch up and maybe ask some questions over the coming months as this research continues. So I think we can...
in the vein of DAO2DAO, I would like to try to get this, even if we edit the initial bit out with our own updates, put in a form that I can share in some forums from some other DAOs, because I actually would be curious to get, you know, again, the sort of feedback from others, because, you know, we have our perspective in PrimeDAO, but as we did this research, the idea is to interrelate with other DAOs. I can imagine putting a forum post in, you know, in OneHive and Metagame and so on, and actually seeing what kind of feedback comes from them, and even collecting that back as an input to this research.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Cool. Well, I think unless there are any other questions to cover in this session, I think we can call this a wrap. And yeah, looking forward to kick off round 2 with you guys.
Yes. Same
Super
here.
excited. Same here.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Good job.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
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 See you in the PrimeDAO Discord.